In the winter of 1817, when frost glazed the hedgerows and the Thames lay pale beneath a hushed London sky, the Earl of Wynthorpe returned home. He came not as the golden heir who had once danced beneath chandeliers, but as a man hollowed by war and rumor. Edward Sinclair, at barely 30, moved with the careful gait of one accustomed to pain. A faint scar traced the length of his left brow, the kind no mirror could ever forgive. Behind him trailed silence, his servants, his reputation, and a shadow that had begun long before the battlefield. London's society, eager for tales and tragedies, had already rewritten his story. They said his fiancée, Miss Eleanor Grant, had drowned in the lake at Wynthorpe Hall the night before their wedding. Some murmured of despair, others of a quarrel, but most agreed the Earl was cursed. His estate had since decayed under neglect, tenants whispered of restless spirits, creditors circled like wolves. Yet Edward, with a soldier's discipline, endured it all. He wore detachment as armor, speaking little, drinking less, and returning every kindness with a courteous, distant nod. Far from his somber world lived Lady Charlotte Ashbury, once the season's radiant debutante, now the quiet keeper of a collapsing legacy. Her father, once a respected viscount, had squandered his fortune in speculation, leaving behind debts and daughters with little to trade but their name. Charlotte, at 22, carried herself with the composure of someone who understood duty more than dreams. Her gowns were mended, her laughter subdued, yet she possessed a mind quick with observation and a heart that refused bitterness. When the Ashburys' solicitor received word that the Earl of Wynthorpe sought a wife of respectable lineage but modest dowry, the proposition struck as both salvation and humiliation. Society saw it as a transaction between ruin and ruin, his estate for her name, her virtue for his title. Still, desperation is a quiet negotiator. Within a fortnight, arrangements were made. Charlotte would marry the Earl, and her family would be spared disgrace. The engagement was announced with restrained politeness, the tone of duty, not delight. Their first meeting occurred beneath the painted ceiling of a Mayfair drawing-room. Charlotte entered in pale blue silk, the color of restraint. Edward rose to greet her, every motion deliberate, his gray eyes unreadable. "Lady Charlotte," he said, his voice low, refined, but heavy with distance. She curtsied, studying the man who had offered her security in place of affection. He was handsome in a way that seemed accidental, his features too grave, his composure too measured. "I hope," he began after a pause, "you understand the nature of this arrangement. I will not offer what I cannot give." Charlotte's fingers tightened around her gloves. "I understand, my lord. I ask for no sentiment, only honesty." He inclined his head. "Then I shall be plain. I'll marry you, but never touch you. My name, my home, my duty, these are yours to claim. But affection," his eyes flickered, briefly haunted. "Affection has no place left in me." For a moment, the words hung between them like frost in the air. She wanted to despise him for his coldness, yet something in his tone, an ache, not arrogance, softened the blow. "Then let us begin as we mean to go on," she replied quietly. "With truth between us." Their wedding was held on a rain-swept afternoon in December, with only a handful of witnesses and a vicar who looked as weary as the vows he recited. The Earl's carriage, black and unadorned, carried them through the countryside to Wynthorpe Hall, a sprawling estate that loomed against the sea. As they approached, Charlotte saw it rise from the mist, gray stone, ivy-clad, its windows glinting like watchful eyes. The hall was beautiful in a lonely way, proud yet mournful, like its master. Inside, the air smelled faintly of smoke and lavender long faded. Portraits of Sinclairs past lined the corridors, their painted eyes following her as she passed. A maid led Charlotte to her chambers, lavish yet untouched, as though prepared for someone else. In the drawing-room below, the Earl stood before the hearth, his figure silhouetted against the fire. When she joined him, he did not look up. "You will find the west wing more comfortable," he said. "My quarters are in the east. If you have need of anything, speak to Mrs. Hensley, the housekeeper. She has run Wynthorpe longer than I have drawn breath." "Thank you, my lord," she replied. The formality between them felt heavier than the journey. He turned at last, eyes meeting hers. "You may call me Edward, if you wish. Titles are for those who still seek approval." She hesitated. "And what shall I be to you?" He almost smiled. Necessary. It was not cruelty, but an admission. She curtsied once more and withdrew, the echo of his footsteps fading behind her. Days at Wynthorpe passed in disciplined silence. Edward kept to his study, attending correspondence and estate matters. At dawn he rode along the cliffs, returning before breakfast, his boots streaked with sea salt. Charlotte, left to navigate the labyrinth of rooms, began to learn the rhythm of the house. The servants treated her with cautious respect, yet there were whispers that followed her down corridors, of the lady before her, whose laughter once filled these halls. Sometimes Charlotte would enter the music room and find the pianoforte open, as though someone had recently played. She told herself it was imagination, though unease lingered like a chill in the air. In time, she began to tend to the estate herself, ordering repairs, visiting tenants, ensuring the kitchens ran smoothly. Edward noticed, though he said little. One evening, as she arranged accounts at the table, he paused in the doorway. "You've been busy," he remarked. His tone was neither approving nor reproachful, merely observing. "Someone must be," she replied without lifting her gaze. He lingered a moment longer. "You remind me of her sometimes," he said quietly, then left before she could ask whom he meant. That night, Charlotte dreamed of water. She saw a pale figure in a white gown standing by a lake, the surface rippling under moonlight. When she awoke, rain lashed against the windows, and somewhere within the hall, a door creaked open by itself. She sat up, heart racing, and listened. Only the wind answered. The following morning, Edward departed for London without notice. A letter, brief and unsigned, arrived 2 days later. "Attend to whatever needs your care. I trust your judgment." No sentiment, only duty. Yet Charlotte found herself staring at the paper as if it contained more than words. Perhaps loneliness sharpens attention to what is absent. She folded the letter and placed it in her drawer. Weeks passed. The winter thawed, revealing the first buds in the garden. Wynthorpe, under Charlotte's quiet governance, began to breathe again. Servants smiled, tenants sent baskets of fresh bread, and laughter, tentative but real, returned to the corridors. Still, each evening, when the sea wind swept across the cliffs, she thought of the man who had promised nothing and given less, and wondered what sorrow had hollowed him so completely. When Edward finally returned, his carriage wheels crackling over the gravel, Charlotte stood at the window watching. He stepped out into the fading light, his expression unreadable. For the first time, he seemed uncertain, almost human. Their eyes met through the glass, two strangers bound by name and circumstance, divided by silence. And though neither spoke, something shifted in the air between them, as if the house itself sensed that the vows once spoken in duty were about to be tested by something far stronger than either had expected. By spring, Wynthorpe Hall seemed to awaken from its long and mournful sleep. The frost melted from the stone balustrades, and daffodils pushed through the softened earth, bright against the gray estate walls. Yet for all the new life around her, Lady Charlotte felt the same hollow quiet between herself and her husband. Edward had returned from London unchanged, his voice measured, his gaze distant, his presence like a shadow that moved through rooms without touching them. At meals, he spoke of crops, tenants, and weather, never of himself. Still, Charlotte sensed something beneath the surface, a restrained turbulence that made her want to understand him, though he gave her no invitation to try. The servants watched them with cautious curiosity. To them, the Earl and Countess were polite strangers, bound by title, separated by silence. But when Charlotte passed Edward in the corridor, she sometimes caught a flicker in his eyes, a fleeting warmth quickly buried. It was enough to keep her restless at night, wondering who he might have been before grief made him this way. Her life within the hall had become one of quiet endurance and small rebellions, reviving the neglected gardens, reopening the library, visiting the cottages of the poor who had long felt abandoned by their lord. Through her care, Wynthorpe began to hum again with human presence. The tenants spoke her name with gratitude, and even Mrs. Hensley, the housekeeper, softened her once stern expression. Edward noticed her efforts, though he rarely acknowledged them. Once, when she returned from the village soaked by a sudden rain, he appeared unexpectedly in the hall. Without a word, he placed his riding cloak around her shoulders before retreating to his study. It was a gesture so brief, so quietly tender, that it left her standing there long after he had gone, wondering if it had meant anything at all. That night, Charlotte sat before her fire, staring at the flames. She thought of how he moved through life like a man half living, half haunted. Curiosity began to gnaw at her. She wanted to know what had happened to Miss Eleanor Grant, the woman who lingered in the whispers of every servant and the sorrow in every room. It was not jealousy that drove her, it was empathy. Whatever curse clung to Wynthorpe was born from pain, not malice. And Charlotte, with a heart too alive to bear silence forever, decided she could no longer live beside a ghost without confronting the truth. The opportunity came one evening when she found Edward in the library, seated before the hearth with a decanter of brandy untouched beside him. He looked up as she entered, his expression weary. "Forgive the intrusion," she said softly. "I needed warmth more than solitude tonight." He nodded, gesturing toward the chair opposite him. For a while, they sat in silence, the crackle of the fire filling the space between them. Then, unable to restrain herself, she spoke. "I've heard so much about her," she began carefully. "About Miss Grant." His posture stiffened, the air between them growing taut. "You've been listening to gossip." "I've been living in a mausoleum," she countered gently. "You've built your life around the memory of a woman who can no longer defend herself." He turned his gaze to the flames. "You think I enjoy this? That I find comfort in ghosts?" "I think you find punishment in them," she replied. "And you mistake it for penance." He drew in a slow breath, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "You presume much for a woman who knows nothing of me." "Then let me know," she said simply. Something in her tone, neither pleading nor defiant, broke through the wall he had built. He stared into the fire as though he could see another time flickering within it. "Eleanor," he said at last, his voice low. She was light itself. "Laughter, youth, everything this place once was. But I was reckless. There were rumors, truth in some of them. I betrayed her trust. The night before our wedding, she discovered what I had done. She fled to the lake. I found her gown floating hours later." He swallowed hard. "I have lived every day since with the certainty that I killed her, though my hands never touched her." Charlotte's chest tightened with quiet sorrow. "You've been mourning your sin, not her," she whispered. "There's a difference." He looked up sharply, as if her words had struck something deep. But before he could reply, thunder rumbled across the sky, shaking the window panes. The wind rose, howling through the chimney. The storm came swiftly, as if summoned by confession. That night, while the household secured shutters and doors, Edward saddled his horse. "Where are you going?" Charlotte demanded, meeting him in the hall, rain already streaming from the eaves. "To the cliffs," he said. "There's a tenant's wall collapsing near the stables." "It's madness to ride out in this," she protested, but he was already gone into the storm. Hours passed. The rain turned violent, sheets of it slashing against the windows. When the stable hands returned near midnight, drenched and frantic, Charlotte ran to meet them. The carriage had overturned by the ravine, the Earl had not returned. Panic seized her, cold and breathless. "Send for lanterns," she ordered. "I'll find him myself." Mrs. Hensley tried to stop her, but Charlotte was already out the door, her skirts whipping in the wind. The path to the cliffs was treacherous, mud sucking at her boots, lightning illuminating jagged rocks below. The air smelled of salt and rain and danger. She called his name into the tempest, her voice carried off by the roar of the sea. At last, a faint cry answered, hoarse, pained. She followed the sound until her torchlight caught a dark shape against the ground. Edward lay half buried in mud, his horse nowhere to be seen. His face was pale, his breath shallow, blood staining his sleeve. "Edward," she gasped, kneeling beside him. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Charlotte," he murmured. Why are you here?" "Because no one else would come fast enough," she said, tearing at the hem of her gown to bind his wound. Her hands shook, but her resolve did not. She lifted him with all her strength, guiding him back toward the path, pausing whenever he stumbled. Rain blinded her, wind tore at her cloak, but she pressed on. Once, he tried to protest, whispering, "Leave me," and she snapped, "Be silent, my lord, or you'll die before I allow it." They reached a shepherd's hut near the ridge, its door half broken. She dragged him inside, coaxing life into a dying fire. Steam rose from his soaked coat as she pressed cloth against his temple. His pulse fluttered faintly beneath her fingers. She stayed beside him through the night, changing bandages, murmuring prayers she scarcely remembered. When his fever climbed, she poured water over his brow and held him until the shivering ceased. At dawn, the storm broke. The air was still, heavy with salt and the promise of light. Edward stirred, groaning softly. His eyes opened to find her leaning over him, her hair damp, her face pale with exhaustion. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, hoarsely, he whispered, "You should not have come." She smiled faintly, her voice trembling. "You told me you would never touch me, my lord. You didn't forbid me to save you." Something fragile passed between them, gratitude, disbelief, something dangerously close to tenderness. He reached for her hand, his fingers cold, his grip uncertain. She did not pull away. Outside, the first rays of dawn crept across the cliffs, and the wind carried the scent of the sea into the small hut. In that pale morning light, the vow he had sworn so solemnly began to crumble, not in words, but in silence, in the quiet realization that his curse had finally met its challenger. When the servants found them the next morning, Charlotte's gown was torn and streaked with mud, her hands trembling as she guided the half-conscious Earl through the rain-soaked fields. The men rushed forward to bear him inside, but Edward refused to release her hand until he was certain she walked beside him. Within hours, Wynthorpe Hall was alive with movement, doctors summoned, fires kindled, whispers weaving through corridors like restless ghosts. Yet even in the fevered chaos, one truth anchored Charlotte: she had faced the storm not for duty, but for something deeper, something unspoken that had begun to take root within her. Edward's recovery was slow, marked by long nights of delirium and half-remembered pleas. Charlotte sat beside his bed, reading softly from the worn psalter that had belonged to his mother. Sometimes he stirred, calling her name in confusion, and she would soothe him with a touch to his brow, her heart aching with the strange intimacy of tending a man who had promised her distance. When, at last, his fever broke, he awoke to find her asleep at his bedside, her head resting against his arm. The sight startled him. For the first time in years, warmth, not guilt, rose within his chest. Days passed. As he regained his strength, Edward began to see the world with disquieting clarity. The estate he had neglected was thriving under Charlotte's quiet command. The servants spoke her name with a kind of reverence, the tenants brought her flowers and thanks. She had done in months what he had not done in years, breathed life into Wynthorpe. And now, because of her, even he was alive again. Gratitude warred with something more dangerous, something he dared not name. He remembered his vow, "I'll marry you, but never touch you," spoken like a shield against weakness. Yet as he watched her move through the house, light in her step, purpose in her eyes, he began to wonder if that promise had been a prison of his own making. One afternoon, when the sun slanted through the drawing-room windows, he found her there, mending a torn curtain. "You've turned my home into something I barely recognize," he said quietly. She glanced up, uncertain whether it was reproach or praise. "Into something worth living in, I hope," she replied, smiling faintly. He studied her, the simplicity of her manner, the steadiness in her voice. "Do you never tire of giving life to things that resist it?" She set her needle aside. "Only when they stop trying to live at all." Their eyes met, hers calm, his restless. He wanted to tell her how the darkness had begun to lift, how her presence had thawed the corners of his soul that he thought forever frozen. But speech was a skill he had long abandoned in matters of the heart. Instead, he turned toward the window, his reflection blurred by sunlight. "You risked your life for me," he said after a pause. "Why?" "Because you mattered," she said softly. "Even if you don't believe you should." That night, he could not sleep. He wandered through the corridors, the moonlight painting silver paths across the floor. In the gallery, he stopped before Eleanor Grant's portrait, the woman whose death had defined him. Her painted eyes, once tender, now seemed distant. "You wanted me to live," he whispered to the silence. "I see that now." For the first time, he felt forgiveness, quiet, hesitant, but real. The following morning, he asked Charlotte to join him by the lake. It was there, years ago, that tragedy had ended his youth. Now he wished to face it once more. The air was crisp, the water still. They stood together at the edge, the wind stirring her hair. "This place has haunted me," he admitted. "Every storm, every night alone, I hear her laughter in it." He looked down, the confession raw on his tongue. "But when you pulled me from that ravine, I thought I heard something else, peace, perhaps. Or the sound of being forgiven." Charlotte reached for his hand, hesitant but sure. "Then let her rest," she said. "Let us both begin from the silence she left behind." He turned to her, eyes dark with feeling. "You speak as though you believe I deserve another beginning." "I believe we all do," she answered. "Even the broken." The wind rippled across the water, scattering light like glass. For the first time since his return from war, Edward smiled, a real, unguarded smile that seemed to astonish even himself. "Charlotte," he said quietly, "I made a promise to you I thought would protect us both. But I see now that it was cowardice dressed as honor." She tilted her head. "And if I release you from it?" He took a step closer, the air between them charged with something tender and uncertain. "Then I may finally learn what it means to live without fear." Before either could speak further, the sky darkened again, a sudden squall sweeping in from the sea. They hurried toward the hall, laughter breaking through the wind for the first time between them. Inside, as thunder rolled overhead, Edward caught her hand in the dim corridor. "You should hate me," he said. "You had every right to." "I tried," she murmured, breathless, "but you make it rather impossible." His lips brushed her knuckles, a gesture both reverent and trembling with restraint. It was not passion, not yet, but the fragile beginning of it. When he released her, there was no distance left to hide behind. The following weeks unfolded with a quiet grace neither had expected. They dined together without pretense, walked through the revived gardens, and shared the small joys that once belonged only to solitude. Charlotte discovered that Edward possessed a dry humor hidden beneath his reserve. He learned that her gentleness could be fierce when defending what she loved. The estate flourished, but so did something more delicate, trust. It grew not from grand gestures, but from the still moments between words, from shared silences that no longer felt empty. One evening, as dusk spilled over the moors, Edward approached her on the terrace. The scent of rain lingered in the air, soft and sweet. "Do you know," he said, "the first night we wed, I feared even your kindness. I thought it would undo me." "And has it?" she asked. "Completely," he replied, his smile small but certain. "And yet, I find I do not mind being undone." She looked at him then, not as the man who had once pitted himself into solitude, but as someone finally returned to life. The sea below murmured like a promise. She reached for his hand, and he did not pull away. The vow he had spoken, the barrier between them, was gone, carried off by time, courage, and the memory of one stormy night that had rewritten both their fates. As the stars emerged above Wynthorpe, Charlotte felt the quiet certainty that love, once given freely, could heal even the most ruinous of hearts. Edward turned to her, voice low, reverent. "You saved me twice," he said. "Once from death, and once from myself." She smiled, eyes glistening with warmth. "Then perhaps," she whispered, "we were both meant to be saved." The wind rose softly, carrying the scent of the sea through the open windows. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale began to sing, a sound rare in that part of England, as if nature itself had found voice again. Within the halls that had long echoed with sorrow, light flickered gently against stone, warm and alive. And though the world outside would never know the full measure of their story, within Wynthorpe Hall, love had finally conquered silence, and the promise once spoken in despair had turned, at last, into grace.